are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
This episode of Rootbound is brought to you by Poke Salad. Head on down to the truck patch and pick yourself a mess of it. Warning, poke salad is toxic if not prepared properly.
Hi everyone, thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I am the host of this program. My name is Steve. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, and each week I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that means something to them, and then I share with a guest about a plant that means something to me, and through this process we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. It is the philosophy of this show that everybody's got a plant that means something to them because plants are so integral to our lives as humans on this planet. But this is one of those special episodes where we're not going to be talking about two plants. We're just going to be talking about one plant, and it's because the guest chose a plant that is on my secret list of plants. That means that it's a plant that means something to me, and so if a guest chooses one of those plants, we just talk about that one. And so let's just get right to it and talk about the humble potato.
What we need's a few good taters.
What's taters, precious? What's taters, eh?
Potatoes. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew.
Hello, Crystal. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Pleasure. I'm super excited.
Wonderful. Do you have a plant to share with us today?
You know, I was really excited about this question because I have been a huge fan of potatoes my entire life, and I myself have never had a chance to talk about potatoes, so I was thrilled to be able to bring this up.
I mentioned to you that I was very surprised we haven't covered potatoes yet, and that also means I have to do something a little bit strange here. I have to play this little sound effect, which actually means this is a special episode where we're not going to talk about two plants. We're only going to talk about one plant because potato is one of the plants that's on my secret list of plants. And so how this will work is you're going to share about potatoes, and I'm going to kind of jump in with maybe a few specifics, things about why potatoes also meaningful to me. Because, I mean, it's one of those plants that's kind of meaningful to everybody, I think. But anyway, let's kick it off. You tell me about potato. Why is potato meaningful to you?
You know, I feel like my love for potatoes came from the idea of it being my desert island item because there's so much multi-use, so much functionality with it. Like you can make French fries, pancakes. As somebody who now cooks so much with their life, I felt like I just get excited about the idea of making potatoes in different facets. And I think I wanted to, expand that to the idea of like, how could I survive on that for the rest of my life if I get stuck on an island? But then through, my intersections of education and food, I started learning a lot about its history and its relevance to the culture in South America where it originated. And I was so inspired actually by a TV show called Chef's Table. They had done an episode with a chef in Peru, and he went through a lot of the history of the different potatoes that were there. There's over 4,000 species of potatoes. And I was just like mesmerized because he created this really gastronomical dish on the potato where it was used again as a storytelling piece. And as somebody who uses that as their medium of communication to the communities that I work with, I just loved that. It took the potato beyond what you see at a farmer's market or in a grocery store. And again, that just became such an inspiring item to me.
That's so interesting. You know, it's so funny because, I mean, I definitely don't feel this way, but I think in some cultural context, potato can be just synonymous with like bland and boring. Right, but it's totally not, and it's really interesting how that came to be. But yeah, as you mentioned, the origin of the potato in Peru is just so multifaceted. It's incredible.
And I think too that it becomes interesting to think about it being bland, but it also had a lot of history with its flowering. It was used in Marie Antoinette. She used it a lot in her adornments on her hair. And again, this goes beyond thinking about like what is a plant without its like extensions, you know, like thinking about the
Mm-hmm.
multi-use of
Mm-hmm.
it all. And I myself am somebody who kind of thinks of themselves as a MacGyver. Like, what can I do with all
Mm-hmm.
parts of things? And um, as you mentioned, it's like most people associate it with blandness or French fries, very, basic things, but there is
Mm-hmm.
this duality that you can almost apply to life in a way.
Sure, absolutely. That is very, very true. Yeah, that's interesting. People, I think we have a tendency to like reduce foods to their like edible part that we think about, but people are like, oh yeah. When you think about it, like, of course, potatoes have flowers, and if you've seen them growing, they have flowers. They look very much almost like tomato flowers because they're the same family. But yeah, they have all this other stuff, and we just think about them more as a food than as the whole plant, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, and I also thought like through this experience, like I was able to get a lot more research done for myself on potatoes, and I found it really fascinating that it was related to tobacco and nightshade, which I was
Yeah, right.
uninformed on that. And again, it shows this complexity to a plant that probably people just assume as a root vegetable that just sits in the ground, you dig it out and you throw it on a plate. And again, there's just like so much to be said about what we I guess take for granted in
Hmm.
agriculture. And I really hope that people really think about these things whenever they're cooking more or having conversations with people about the things that they eat.
Makes a lot of sense to me. So yeah, let's get into some of the stuff you learned about the potato. What are some fun facts and dazzling details about this awesome little tuber?
You know what I thought was the most interesting was that people really love talking about the fact that it was the first plant grown in space. They
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, I think it was, and I don't know if you've ever done this project in class where we took the seed and we would put it into a paper towel and you would watch it
Mm.
grow. That was the
Mm-hmm.
one that we used, and it shows so
Oh.
much the versatility of the plant and its strength and its ability to handle all climates. I mean, it's also grown predominantly mostly in all 50 states, and it's
Mm-hmm.
an item that's been transported to different countries. As mentioned, it was originally found in South America as far back as I think it was stating 3,000 to 8,000 BC, somewhere in that realm.
Sounds right.
There
Yeah.
were still there were archaeologists that found, I guess, basically fossils now of potato spuds, and it shows you the ways in which it's been able to adapt in Europe and has been able to explore different, I guess, different ecosystems of things and been able to, like, I guess, evolve, but not necessarily lose any of its integrity, which goes
Yeah.
back to the
Yeah.
space thing.
Well, and I think it's also, and this is something I don't know the scientific part of this, so if scientists out there get at me, but some plants are a lot better at be, like becoming different varieties than others, right? Like some plants, kind of resist the change of variety and like cultivating and cultivarization. And there might be a better word for that. But there are just so many potato cultivars, and I'm just curious about on the scientific side why it's so good at that. But that's I think one of the reasons why it has been so successful is because it is relatively easy for people and nature to like select it for the properties they need for any specific time, which I think is very, very fascinating.
Yeah, you can also like store it up to a year. If you think about like the ability to preserve things and like be able to self-sustain your family, if you could think about that and have this understanding that if I had these X, Y, and Z things in my pantry, I'm able to like create versatile meals. And a lot of times I know that can be overwhelming for people when it comes to like food access or things like that. So it's like what else could you do to like envision a potato is more so like on the plate versus like
Hmm.
in the ground, which is again great because we see so many things change and lose their nutrition, which obviously is the most important. It's actually seen too in the some of the information I found to use for ailments. They
Mm.
used some of the boiled water from the potatoes for muscle soreness. They also
Mm.
used a bit of the peeling in the skins for colds, which
Mm.
again, like I'm
Hmm.
assuming there's a little. It's probably because of the vitamin C and
Hmm.
a lot of the B6 in there. But it's
Hmm.
just, again, what else could we do with this? I'm gonna throw it in a first aid kit if I need to.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That's true. Yeah, very true. Okay, that brings me to one of the fun facts and dazzling details, and maybe you know this, but I love this. And I actually mentioned this on the episode where we talked about sweet potato, and it's the origin of the word potato. Do you know this one?
No, I don't.
So this is so funny because the word potato is actually linked to the it's I think a Taino word, which was batatas, which is the word for the sweet potato, not the potato. They are two different distinct genuses, very different. The sweet potato is Ipomea batatas, which is actually related to morning glory. The leaves look very much like morning glory. And the potato is Solanum tuberosus, which is in this nightshade family. So the word potato comes from sweet potato. And I don't know how this happened, but at some point, the potato got referred to as the potato, and then the sweet potato in English became the sweet potato, even though the original potato is like that word refers to sweet potato. And at one point, apparently in English, people called it the potato, the sweet potato, and then they called the other potato the bastard potato, which that was good. Which I guess if you run into the sweet potato first and you taste this one, and then you're expecting to bite into something that tastes like that other potato, you might be a little shocked, I guess.
Right. And it's
You,
so
you,
funny how they disown things like that. They're like,
yeah,
that's not for
yeah,
us.
yeah, for sure. But anyway, somehow the other, I feel like at least in Europe and the United States now, I think the potato is more of a thing. So somehow people got over that name, and then it kind of surmounted the name of the other potato. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm sure it also got a bit of a bad rep during their Irish famine, but I think there was
Hmm.
just a lot of misinformation around that because of the fungal
Hmm.
properties that grew
Hmm.
on the potatoes. But now it's got its own, I guess, rebrand, as they say.
Yeah.
I even follow an account on social media that it's a chef that makes only dishes with potatoes, and I literally
Whoa.
get so excited. She's even coming up with a cookbook that has like 100 different potato recipes. And again, it just shows you there's just more than meets the eye, right? And there's
Yeah.
so much that you can say with the potato, more specifically, like what you can do with it and apply it to so many different creations in our life and get a little bit of vitamins in different ways.
So what are some of your favorite ways to prepare potatoes that maybe that are a little outside the box, or maybe just the more like traditional?
I definitely say I am a huge fan of like the crispiness of potatoes. So in any fashion that I can have that, if it's a tater tot, if it's a fry, I just like to be able to taste the saltiness and the richness. It kind of almost just reminds me of the earth in some way. Like it just
Mm.
reminds me of that direct farm to table concept of eating. And that also applies to my other version of eating it is like just straight like cold potatoes, not boiled. I like to boil
Sure.
them and then put them in like a potato
Mm.
salad.
Mm.
But honestly, the most things that make me most compelled to potatoes is just adding salt. Something about the salt
Mm.
combination with the starch, and of course, it's actually 80% water. Just like makes it like almost like a watermelon. That's a very bad
Mm.
comparison to
Hmm.
some, but
Sure.
to me, it just has like that moisture and that complexity and flavor when you again add a bit of seasoning to it.
What do you go for when it comes to choosing a variety or cultivar when you're in the store and you see that kind of like rainbow section of all the potatoes, which we can lucky to have access in the modern day? What are you drawn to?
I'm a sucker for purple potatoes. I don't
Oh
know.
yeah.
I think it was because I spent a lot of time with different farmers in
Hmm.
Texas, and there was somebody who had a variety of purple potatoes. And every time I ate them, again, I would pretty much. I've been a big proponent of eating things straight as is, and there's again just so much complexity to just that potato without needing to do a lot to it. And I
Hmm.
also like that it has a little bit more looser texture. So you're not like chunking in there and like you're gonna
Hmm.
like lose a tooth sometimes with some like potatoes that aren't fully ripe at that time.
I grew those one time, and they are just stunning, right? Like
Yeah,
it's
too.
amazing that color can grow in the ground. Yeah, it's so cool.
I think that's also my favorite thing. I really enjoy that. that it does have a different variety of colors because, again, it pushes people away when they're like, I don't want this boring white potato on my table. Like, and of course, just like people then design, they're like, this is not as, but again, it's like, you don't know, what that could mean to a dish if it really just had, simple things mean a lot. I wish I remembered this quote. But there was a quote that mentioned how, things that don't ask for a lot of attention usually are some of the most divine things. And that resonates so much with this potato conversation.
Wonderful. That's very interesting. I wonder if you, the one thing I have in my notes here, which is leading me to, and I wonder if you came across this, is the story, and it might be apocryphal, but this is a story about how the potato became popular in Europe.
No, I didn't get into that one.
This is super fascinating. So, I think Europeans were pretty cautious of potatoes and tomatoes because nightshade stuff in Europe, most of the nightshades in Europe are poisonous. In fact, lots of parts of some parts of potato are, and if you leave a potato in the sun, it will develop this like solon something. I forget the name of the chemical, solanine, I think, which is actually, if the peel of a potato gets green because you leave it in like light conditions, can make you sick. Because they're linked to this family. So like Europeans were really cautious of both tomatoes, and I mentioned that in my episode about tomatoes, and potatoes. They didn't want to eat them because they were like, what is this? It's linked to this poisonous thing. And the story goes that Frederick the Great of Prussia wanted to get people eating potatoes because they're so productive, right? They produce so much food per hectare. But people were very hesitant. And so the story goes, and this, like I said, might be apocryphal, but it's a good story, that he made this royal potato field, and he grew all these potatoes, and then he set guards all around the potatoes to like keep people away. But then he told the guards kind of on the side, just look the other way if people try to steal the potatoes. So the idea was like make people think it's something that the rich people want, and then let them steal them, and so then people were like, oh, this is something cool, and so then people were taking them and then started growing them. Supposedly that's how it really became something that people accepted eating and accepted. I was trying to find some exact sources of that, and I just found, like you do on the internet today, find a lot of people repeating the same thing. So the 100% truth of that, I'm not sure, but it is a good story.
I mean, also, I would understand that. It's like that whole concept of like, oh, I want what they have mentality, and it also, kind of probably peaked a little bit more in that concept whenever, in like the 1800s, people like treat potatoes like gold. Like it was like very much this concept of like it being necessary to life. And I think it's a great story. Again, it gives it a little bit more personality. It makes it feel like people weren't like, we grow this fruit, potato, and then we called it, call it a dish.
Yeah, and I always wondered that, and I actually get to the main reason why I wanted to talk about potato with you, because of why it's meaningful to me, and I didn't really think about this that clearly until we decided we're going to talk about potato, but I did always wonder, how did the potato become so popular in Europe in a relatively short period of time, and so much so that when there was this blight in Ireland, it was so devastating, right? And part of it is because I think that story related to Frederick the Great, but also just because the main key of that is because it's so easy to grow, and the amount of food you can get in a relatively small amount of land is very impressive. So I didn't know the exact details of this until we started talking, but the Great Hunger, sometimes known as the Irish Potato Famine, started in 1845 when this fungus called Phytophthora infestans, which is like a water mold, was causing potato crops to fail. 1845 is also the year where my, I think, 3 or 4 times great-grandfather was born in Ireland. And then by 1850... they were in the United States. So like my history, my story, that side of my family is directly related. I can't tell if that's why they left, but that's probably why they left, because that's why a huge influx of Irish immigrants came to the United States. And the fact that this, I guess would be, my great-grandpa. My great-great-great-grandpa, who was born in 1845, wouldn't have come here. And he was born in the year it started, right? So I can only imagine that, like, how difficult that would be, right? To have like this small child who, like, they got to the U.S. but before he was 5 in this place where, like, the food situation was terrible. But that led me down to this whole rabbit hole about the famine. I don't know if you have anything in your notes about this. It's a really fascinating story.
Yeah, I'm kind of similar to you. Like I had a lot of family history connected. Most of my family is Irish, so it kind of felt like a little personal through the journey of that. But that is so important to where you've come now to think about, because a lot of times we don't spend so much kind of archiving our history. I mean, I know our older generations probably spent more time with genealogy because they were connected to it, but we're starting to get in a day and age where that like connection is starting to get lost, and we're not even printing photos anymore, and it's so important to take these moments to kind of like reflect on that and think about the connections on what those mean in a community standpoint. Because even I'm sure they probably came with other people in their communities, and there was probably just like this connection to that. But it is fascinating to think about what those people were experiencing mentally through that time, because again, they were brought this thing. This wasn't growing there initially. So they were all in the position of like they like didn't know what to do. I'm sure, and they were kind of like scrambling, trying to understand the complexities of what was going on. They were like, "This is just a plant we grow, right? Like, why is it doing this and causing such a disastrous outcome for us on a larger scale?"
Well, and this is where I knew a little bit about this in the back of my mind, but I just brushed up on this, and the more I read, the more like kind of galling it was, because the misconception of the potato famine is that it's because of the potatoes. It was really because of British colonialism. So
Yes.
I have some stats here that during the potato famine, the 1947, which I guess was the first year, the worst year. It started in 45, but 47 was like really the worst. In 47, 1.3 million gallons of grain-derived alcohol were exported to Britain from Ireland. So like grain that could have been used as food was turned into alcohol and shipped to England. 800,000 gallons of butter were exported from Ireland to England.
Wow.
The exports just didn't stop, and they had this situation of, in Ireland, of British colonialism, where there was absentee landowners, people who lived in London, owned tons of land, had tenant farmers who basically paid with the food they grew themselves to pay for the land. And so that left these Irish farmers with very small pieces of land that were not very good quality, and the thing you could grow there was potatoes.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
And you could grow a lot of food in a small... So there was kind of this force to grow this food that could feed your family in the land that you had left because of this, like, rich landowner situation. And there was a particular variety called the lumper potato that was really great because it grew in super poor soil and it grew really big. But that led to this system of monocropping and only growing one variety, which when this fungus came around was devastating because that's what everyone was growing. But it's not because the Irish only wanted to eat potatoes. Right?
Yeah, 100%.
Right? They couldn't. So anyway, there was super galling facts, like the British Prime Minister. Talk about a villain. The British Prime Minister at the time, a guy named Lord John Russell, he deemed that the blight was an act of providence, and he thought that it was like a way of, like, God controlling the population of the Irish people, and just like really kind of disgusting behavior. And it's really interesting that we all immediately learn that it's because of the potatoes.
Right, because that's initially how people think everybody expatted from Ireland to America,
Yeah.
and you're like, that's the very small line
Right.
in the history of all of this.
Right. That was like kind of the switch that made all that system kind of crumble, but it's because of greed of a colonial power, which I think is really interesting. And so, like, understanding that and my connection to it and where I am in that complex history that is linked to food and plants is always super interesting to me. And through this podcast, I'm always surprised at how much, like, things are like that, of like how I didn't even know I had some kind of interesting historical connection to a plant, but it pops up all the time.
I love that. I mean, that's why I think that's such a great question to ask, and I was really grateful for this opportunity to talk about it. I mean, it's even something now that we see that was brought to America, and then French fries were introduced, and the longevity of this one plant, and the ability to just have seen it travel the world and be able to like create different cultural moments for people, I think is so important. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, with the alcohol, I mean, it's, was it probably larger conversations being had about it during the Prohibition because it was used for vodka.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
again, it's one of these things that if you boil it down to the nitty gritty of it all, if it's like just not taking things for granted as well. It's like if what if the potato would have even have made it this far? Like, what are the innovations and things we would have lost, or just like simple opportunities we would have missed?
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Do you have anything else in your notes there about potatoes? Uh,
I think
yeah.
my
What do
other
you got?
favorite one that I really enjoyed was that it was just honestly the history of like once it made it to America and was predominantly popularized after that, and the facts that that obviously like are kind of I guess silly to some is the records, like they're the largest ones were like almost the size of a dog.
Whoa.
Yeah, like I think it was like near, like it was near, I guess it was near like 10 pounds was like Guinness records. And then of course, just the sizing, as you mentioned earlier, somebody was able to grow, I think they said about 301 potato spud. Like it just sprouted and then it grew.
Whoa.
And again, it's like, wow, like I didn't think that, I thought, it just like grew and people pulled it out of the dirt.
Mhm.
And I have seen like larger fruits and vegetables being grown, but just again, just like imagining those things at that scale just kind of made me giggle a little.
Yeah, that's true, man. A potato the size of a dog. I have to look up that. I'm sure there's a great Guinness
Yeah.
picture of that somewhere. And it's so heavy, I imagine. I mean that. Yeah, that's a
Imagine
really
cutting
interesting.
that up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. What would you make with the world's largest potato? Like, that's a good question. You'd
You'd have
have
to
to cut it
grind
up.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe mashed potatoes. There'd be a lot of mashed potatoes, or I don't know. I guess you could make a bunch of French fries with just the one potato. Yeah,
Yeah, 100%. Feed a community with that.
yeah, indeed. There's something really cool about those tuberous plants. So I talk a lot on one of my favorite plants is the sunchoke, which is the tuberous sunflower. It's a really awesome plant. I don't know if you've had that before, but this the amount of food that can be grown under the earth, and that is like a pretty efficient way to do it because that leaves the above the plant earth plant part to just continue photosynthesis. Whereas if you're eating like a green vegetable, you have to take the photosynthetic part of the plant, and so therefore like the yield is more difficult. But the fact that they can just leave this photosynthesizing part above the ground, and then the edible part is below the ground is a pretty cool way to do it. And some of the most productive plants in the world are those tuberous plants, like the sweet potato and the sunchoke.
I love that. Again, it's, I won't say it's like misinformation, but there is a lot of lack of information in regards to like what you can and can't eat and like fruits and vegetables. Because of course, like a lot of times you go to the farmer's or market or the grocery store and we see like even just like leaves or flowers on, like a lot of people don't know that you can eat those. And again, it's like thinking about what goes to waste and ends up getting tossed in the trash and food waste and things like that. And it's like if we were able to know what was edible for us, we would be able to like salvage so much more in the process.
Yeah, I totally agree. Even though I don't think you can eat the leaves of the potato. But
No,
maybe I'm
definitely
wrong about
no, no.
that one is not. Yeah, not that one.
Disclaimer there, no leaf
Yes,
eating.
indeed. Yeah. But there's enough below the earth that's good for that. I have one more little thing that when we decided we're going to talk about potatoes that I think really meant something to me, and this is like connected to like not my historical story, but my like personal story, and that's even though I don't have any like historical connection to Switzerland, I did live in Switzerland for about 5 years, and it was a pretty like important time in my like 20s, one of those moments that you'll always reflect on. And the Swiss, like the Irish, the potato became a very important food, even though it's not from Switzerland, and it's because it's just such a good powerhouse food. And have you ever had rushti? Are you familiar with rushti?
I don't think I have.
Rushti is a really awesome food. It is spelled R-O with an umlaut and then S-T-I. And it's essentially hash browns. But I didn't know really the story behind it, but it's on if you go to any Swiss restaurant or you're in Switzerland and you're into a restaurant that serves like traditional Swiss food, it's on every menu. It's like one of the main, it's like fondue, raclette, and rösti. Those are like the three Swiss main dishes. And rösti originated in the canton of Bern, Switzerland. And the idea was it was made for breakfast for the farmers because it's a really energy-intensive meal. And it was made often with the leftover potatoes from the night before. And there's something magical about making fried potatoes with already cooked potatoes. If you want crispy potatoes, you got to at least parboil them.
Right.
But if you like boiled potatoes and you have a few for dinner and then the next day you shred them up, and you put them in a frying pan, they're going to get crispy and brown way more. And there's something scientifically that happens to the starches that make that happen. And that's where rösti comes from. So with rösti, they would grate the potatoes into a big like cast iron, and they would fry it on both sides, and then often stick it in the oven with some cheese and stuff on top. And
You're making my mouth water right now.
Yeah, you got to check it out. It's an awesome dish. Sometimes they crack an egg, like a fried egg on top. Some bacon. I mean, it's like it's a real farmer food for sure.
I'm looking up this recipe immediately.
Yeah.
No, this is amazing. I get it too. It's just like this so fun that you can just add so many layers to that.
Yeah. And so then that leads to this really fun thing that if you ever go to Switzerland and you spend a little bit of time there, eventually you're going to come across this word that's a really fun word that's called Röstigraben. And people will talk about the Röstigraben. And the Röstigraben literally translates to the rösti, so like the fried potato, trench. And what this refers to is Switzerland is an interesting country that Switzerland has 4 official languages. So German, French, Italian, and then there's a little tiny language called Romansh, which is only spoken by a very small people, but it's still official language. But the 2 biggest parts are the German and the French part. And the Röstigraben refers to this imaginary border between the French part and the German part, because on one side they eat rösti and on the other side they don't.
Oh.
So they call it the rösti. Yeah.
Coexisting together.
Yeah, it's a little bit like, to make a American connection, it's a little bit like the Mason-Dixon line, but not. It's an imaginary border between cultures, essentially.
Right, right.
And in Switzerland, it's really weird because like you literally will be on a train and cross over, and everything just switches languages. And the street signs will be in French, and then like a kilometer later, they're all in German.
And then they're all just brought together by this dish.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they don't eat rösti on the French side, which is funny.
Gotcha.
So that's why it's the Röstigraben, because that's the border. That's where the Germans eat the rösti and the French don't. And so that's why it's like the border. And so that's kind of the joke of like you're crossing the Röstigraben. And I wanted to get to the bottom of this, of like, why did they choose this word Röstigraben? It's kind of like the potato trench. Why did they choose this? And it has a little bit of a complicated history too, like most things. So the word, I think, get coined, and I was trying to find the original coinage for like where did it first appear written, but that's pretty hard, especially not being able to search very well in German. But a lot of sources say that it came about around World War I. In World War I, Switzerland was neutral, like they were in World War II, and generally tend to be. But they still had this German and this French side, and so there was tensions internally about which side, the French side favored the French in World War I, and the German side favored the German, even though as a country they were neutral. And at some point, the Swiss army was deployed basically in the area where the Röstigraben is, because the French side is where the plains are, and then the mountains start on the German part. And so if you're going to invade Switzerland, you would come from that French side. It would be easier.
Right.
And so these mostly German troops were deployed along this area on the border, and I think I can only imagine that it was a humorous reference to. So the word Graben in German means trench, and trench warfare was a thing in World War I. But
Right.
Switzerland didn't have any trench warfare, but they did have the Röstigraben, the border, the trench where the people stopped eating rösti. It's the only reason why I can think that word Graben was chosen at the time when that word was such a culturally relevant word. But I couldn't find a specific reference to it, and so any Swiss people out there, if you want to like confirm, that's why. But I think that's why it was chosen. You had a lot of like, and it's still a thing. It's really fascinating, like how united Switzerland can be with these huge cultural differences. I think this is a much later addition, but people started referring to the border between the German and the Italian part as the Polentagraben, because so, so like,
So food's a binder, you know?
totally, totally. So anyway, it's a pretty fun thing. So that's those are the main things that I like. I was thinking about the meaningfulness of potato to me is this Irish connection, but then also having lived in Switzerland and how important it was, like these two foods and how they're kind of tied very different parts of my life together through the same plant.
It's a lot of personal connection too when you think about, like, I don't know if you did this in school, but when we did that electrical circuit thing, they used the
Oh
potato as the
God.
electrifier, And then, thinking about, like, what is the only, like, fruit and vegetable toy that we had? Potato head.
Oh
Like,
my gosh.
you think
You're
about it, it's
right.
like we were introduced, like, I don't want to say that's like, like some sort of culty thing, but, we've been introduced to potato in so many different facets of our child, French fries, right? And so
Yeah.
you think about these cultural moments of potatoes is really shown, and you're like, oh, wait, it's been so important to our, like, life.
Gosh, and I didn't think about the potato battery thing, which is so so fascinating. And then Mr. Potato Head, which I guess originally was just selling the pieces, and then you were supposed to put them into an actual potato. I think the original version of that toy was like they just sold the face parts, and
Yeah,
then
and
you
then
would
you
like
attach
push them
it.
into a potato. Until-
I mean, then it goes back to the conversation of, like, what do people do in times of hardship? It's just like
Mhm.
creating innovation through the things that they have, and just feeling inspiration from that. That's where some of the best
Mhm.
inventions come from. And
Yeah.
now we have this cultural character for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, that's so so interesting. Actually, it leads me back to actually one more Swiss dish, which is raclette,
Oh,
which is
love
this
raclette.
where and the cheese is the star of that one, but you put it over the potatoes, and I really I think this is pretty common knowledge, the idea that a lot of like either gourmet foods or even just like foods that stand for a cultural identity start off as the foods eaten by like the peasants and the people from the lowest classes, and then it kind of filters up. And just like Rushdie's a thing. It was like, hey, we've got leftover potatoes from last night. Let's stick them in let's fry them up and eat them for breakfast. Raclette is this dish where it's wintertime. And what do you have in winter? You have cheese in the cellar. You've got potatoes in the cellar. Let's just melt the cheese and put it on the potatoes, and that's what we can eat, right? Fondue is very similar with the stale bread and the melted cheese. And so, I think that's what's pretty interesting about that. And potatoes are a great one for that because you're right, the storage is huge, and eating in the winter that's hard. And so, if you can store something with so many calories, it's really really key.
Yeah, starch is really key. I think, of course, you think about, like, certain cultures where they're not communicating, like, where these vitamins and nutrients are coming from. And again, I'm a sucker for cheese, so I think that's the other combination in which I will live and die by the potato.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Like, it literally makes me so happy whenever I see potatoes. Like, if I'm having a hard day, I'm genuinely, like, very interested in, like, a bowl of mashed potatoes, salt and pepper, and cheese. I even mentioned the other day that I wanted a baked potato.
I haven't had a baked
It's
potato in
just,
so long.
it's just these things are just like novelty to some, but it just has so
Hmm.
much, again, personal connection that really just makes you feel home and happy feelings, and it just helps your mental health when you can have something like that as, like, a safe food.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, so what are you thinking about when you cooking potatoes next? What's on your
I don't know. I'm really interested in the Trishti we were talking about, and also
look it up?
Raclette. I'm like, what? I haven't even thought about that in a while. But I also have a ton of small varietied potatoes, and I was actually really interested in doing, like, a lemon herb blend. Just with the
Oh yeah.
springtime, you constantly think about just herbs and just agriculture really starting to bloom right now. So I really am in love with just trying to marinate things with herbs and really exploding flavor in my mouth as much as possible.
Hmm. Yeah, potatoes with that herbs and also like lemon juice, so like adding that tanginess to potatoes. They are so versatile. I think, man, yeah. I was trying to think. I guess the only thing that potatoes don't really pop up in, but maybe we can think of an exception to this. They're not really used much in desserts, are they? Potatoes.
True. That is so true. I mean, I
Is
wouldn't
there?
even knock it for, like, some sort of sorbet. I think if you put, like, an olive
Ooh,
oil drizzle on top, that seems to be
ooh,
a very
ooh.
big a thing right now. People love to have olive oil. So maybe doing that and a little like Himalayan salt, and then you have like this
Mm.
little richness, brown sugar, maybe a little dash of honey in there.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like
Mm-hmm.
it's not something that people would immediately gravitate toward. You'd have to coerce
Yeah.
somebody to take a bite.
Yeah.
But I think again, it's like once you realize that there's just again that starch holds all the flavor for you, and it
Mm-hmm.
explodes once you add salt or things that have citrus to really
Mm-hmm.
explode the component of that. The
Yeah, for
science of it
sure.
all. I wish I was more chemistry versed in the
Yeah,
cooking education.
for sure. I wonder, before we wrap up here, I know that you like have this company that does like events and things like that. Potatoes. Maybe you could mention that company a little bit, and also do potatoes ever center on some of those menus?
Oh, yes. I have a company, Sustain Frame. I built this with the intention of educating people on social and environmental justice issues. I found the world is very complex. We're constantly being informed on so many issues and asking to be participate in different movements, which is totally fair. But I think a lot of times we forget that people are not, either educated or
Mm,
informed, or maybe this information just can be completely, I don't know, and not connect to their personal lived experience. And I
mm-hmm.
think that if we were able to have creative experiences that help people understand what advocacy and activism looks like for them, then they could be a better supporter of these movements. Or
Mm,
again, look for different innovations and challenges for them to help tackle that fits their own skill set and knowledge. And I definitely use potatoes through any of the experiences that I can, because again, food to me is a binder. It is a talking piece. It is it a an emotional connection, as we just heard here today. Like I think there's so
mm-hmm.
much to be said about what food can do, and so it is really important. And of course, I do my best to source all things locally. So if I'm hosting events in different communities, different cities, I try to find local produce and options that really again help people feel connected to what is around them. And of course, if I can get my hands on some potatoes, I will do whatever I can to create a really creative dish with that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Crystal, for chatting with me about the humble potato.
Anytime, anytime.
P-O T-A T-O Big Potato, Idaho. The corn grows tall in Kansas, Mo. The cows ain't small in Ohio. But you should see how tall things grow in Big Potato, Idaho. The hens lay eggs so large and round, you just can't lift them off the ground. No wonder those old roosters crow in Big Potato, Idaho. You ought to see those 10-foot tomatoes, and what you suppose? When you see mountains, those are not mountains, they're big potatoes. It makes no difference where you've been, the wonders of the world you've seen. You ain't seen nothing till you go to Big Potato, Idaho.
Before we wrap up today, I have a couple more fun facts and dazzling details about potatoes that didn't make it into the conversation I just had with Crystal. So the audience of the show will know that one thing I like to do is go on archive.org and look for old songs that mentions the plants that we're talking about on the episode. And so I was doing that, looking for songs about potatoes, and it brought up a couple of questions that I realized we didn't talk about on the program. So the first one is related to the song we just heard, which was called Big Potato, Idaho by Jill Whitney. And that made me think, why is Idaho so well known for potatoes? And it's like everything, it is a complicated answer. Kind of the easy answer is that there's really good soil and really good sources of water. And it was just particularly in the mid 1800s, really just fertile farmland, and so it was a great place to grow potatoes. But it's more complicated than that because other places had good farmland. And so the other thing I think it is similar to the Frederick the Great story, it was also just good marketing. I think Idaho has been particularly good at marketing their potatoes. In fact, the phrase Idaho's famous potatoes is a registered trademark by, I think, the Idaho Potato Commission or something like that. And Idaho is also the place where most potatoes in the United States come from. 30% of all potatoes in the United States are grown in Idaho. But that still doesn't get us to this idea of why is Idaho so well known? What's the story there? So I found one reference. There's a really awesome academic paper that's called The History and Origin of Russet Burbank Potatoes, also known as the netted Jim potato. And the Russet Burbank, you probably know, that's the classic baked potato, the big potato. It's called the Russet Burbank. Sometimes you just heard it called the russet potato. Russet for the orangish color on the outside, and Burbank is named after this botanist named Luther Burbank, who was trying to develop a potato that had the similar qualities to the lumper potato, but was not susceptible to the blight that caused the potato famine in Ireland. And he ended up crossing a bunch of different potatoes and finding some seeds from some particular varieties. It's quite a long story, but a potato he made through a few different generations became the Russet Burbank, and it was named after him. So that's where we got the Russet Burbank. But why Idaho still? Because this actually, that development apparently happened in California, I guess. But this is a story that I read in this academic paper, really interesting, and it basically is talking about the railroads. And a lot of things in the United States in the 1800s happened because of connections of the railroads. And the story goes that the superintendent of dining cars on the Northern Pacific Railway, which is a railway that served Oregon and Washington, Idaho, and then all the way over to Minnesota, this superintendent of dining cars overheard another guest on the railway talking about how he was having trouble selling these giant, 5-pound potatoes he was growing in the Yakima Valley of Washington State. And he thought, hey, that sounds like something that I could sell in my dining cars on the Northern Pacific. So he started sourcing this kind of potato, which was a Russet Burbank potato. And he sourced some from the Yakima Valley, but he also sourced some in Idaho. And I think through probably sheer force of marketing will, or maybe some other factors, the Idaho potato became more famous, and they were shipped kind of all across the country. They store really well, which is another great thing about the Russet Burbank, and a lot of potatoes, but particularly the Russet potato. It made it all around the country and became very famous. Idaho did a really great job of marketing them, and so I think that is kind of the beginning of how Idaho started to become well known for the potato. Now, there was one last little unexpected familial connection to the potato in this story. So I mentioned that the first giant Russet Burbanks that this superintendent of the dining car of the Northern Pacific heard about came from the Yakima Valley in Washington State. And I actually have some family going way back who were farmers in the Yakima Valley. And so I like to imagine that maybe they were growing potatoes, and maybe one of my family's potatoes ended up on a train car and ended up spurring this fandom of this particular potato. So I thought that was very interesting, and that song about Big Potato Idaho kind of triggered this research in me, so I thought that was pretty interesting. The next little fun fact and dazzling detail I want to share came up when I heard a song, which we'll hear at the end of this episode, about potato chips. Yes, how did we not mention potato chips? They are so awesome, and they are so universal, and such a cool thing you can do with potatoes. And I started looking up the origin story of the potato chips, and I actually remembered someone telling me this story before, and apparently it's fairly apocryphal, but I'm going to kind of talk through that anyway. So potato chips have been written about in cookbooks various times throughout the decades prior to when this origin story of the potato happens. But this story is widely regarded as to when they became really popular. And that popularization of the potato chip happened in Sarasota Springs, New York, at a place called Moon's Lake House. And the story goes that the chef of Moon's Lake House, who was this guy named George Crum, had a very difficult customer who was complaining about the potatoes he was serving. Now, in some versions of the story, the customer is Cornelius Vanderbilt, the famous American magnate. And apparently he did eat there, but it's not sure. Actually, the story's probably not even true. But anyway, go with me. It's a little bit like the Frederick the Great story. The case is that this customer was being very picky, saying, hey, these potatoes are too thick, these potatoes aren't salty enough, these potatoes are too squishy, and they kept sending them back. And so the chef, frustrated, said, hey, I'm just going to slice them super thinly, I'm going to cover them in salt, and I'm just going to deep fry them till they're so crispy they crunch and shatter. And so he served them, and the story goes is this guy really loved them, and that's how the potato chip became popular. Now, like I said, that's probably not true. Actually, some people say that it was actually his sister, Catherine Wicks, who invented the potato chip by accident, by actually dropping a thinly sliced potato into a deep fryer. And the actual story of how they're created is not 100% clear, but it seems that George Speck, his sister Catherine Wicks, and this place, Moon's Lake House in Saratoga Springs, were kind of the core of it. And then Crumb even opened his own restaurant later and served potato chips. And there's now a Saratoga Chips company that still exists today, and kind of it spread from there. So the real story of its invention is a little bit apocryphal, really hard to track down. But that's where it happened. Super interesting. And by the way, do yourself a favor and read the Wikipedia for this guy, George Crumb. Actually, his real name was George Speck, and the story of how he got the name George Crumb is pretty funny. And he's just a very super interesting guy. So do yourself a favor, read that Wikipedia page. And with that, let's wrap up this episode, and let's hear a little song about potato chips, and we'll see you on the next episode of the show. Thanks for listening.
Mother sent me to the store, and what do you think she sent me for? Okra, lentils, nutmeg, split peas, pizzas, noodles, tamales, Swiss cheese, and a great big pumpernickel bread. And what do you think that I brought home instead? Potato chips, love that crunch. Potato chips, love to munch. Potato chips, smack my lips when I eat potato chip. Yes, indeed. Potato chips, so delicious. Potato chips, better than Knishes. Potato, how I love the crunch when I munch a crispy bunch. It's all the lunch I need. Potato chips, me oh my oh me oh. Potato. Even love to spell it, run to where they sell it. Gotta have a snack of, got to get a sack of potato chips. Potato chips. Potato chips. Smack my lips when I eat potato chips. Yes, indeed. Potato chip. That's all I need. Potato chips. P-O-T-A, smack my lips. Love to munch 'em, love to crunch 'em. P-O-T-A-T-O, potato chips.
My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Crystal Frame. Crystal is the founder of Sustain Frame, which is a production agency specializing in events centering on environmental and social justice. It is a place where food, music, and arts converge, and you can learn more about her company on her website, which is sustain-frame.com, and there will also be links to all of her social media stuff in the show notes. Rootbound is hosted by Big Potato, Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegescota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. You know, Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside and you find yourself cooking over an open flame, don't forget to include some potatoes. You could mash them, boil them, or even stick them in a stew.
Poke salad is toxic if not prepared properly. Always boil leaves in at least 3 changes of water. Never eat the berries or the roots. Do not eat poke salad if you are allergic to poke salad. Poke salad.